Afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. Hope you had a good quick lunch break there. Got a full afternoon of presentations, and if everything goes right, we'll wrap up right on time or a little bit early. So hopefully by 4 o'clock, and we'll take a quick little 10-minute break for coffee and fresh air and check your emails at about 2 o'clock. So welcome to our forum. We are, okay. Recordings will be available at the end of the presentations. Watch your emails for details. Reminder that our webinar series has returned. First one's tomorrow. Would appreciate some more registrations for it. It's free. It's Eco Canada's employment programs. There's funding of up to I think it's $25,000 or $30,000 for new hires for I believe science grads into engineering technology. So you might want to tune in. It's only a half hour tomorrow. Next week is our emerging contaminants forum next Wednesday and all day. Lots of great presentations covering not just the usual PFAS stuff, but there's some other contaminants. So it should be a good full day. And don't forget, REMTech's just a month away, the virtual version. We got a great lineup and program, so I hope you can join us for that. Thank you to all the presenters. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon of this day. And I'm just going to throw in a shameless book plug for my book. It's hitting the book stands as we speak. It's out. People are starting to receive their pre-orders, and it's seen it in the store yesterday. So hopefully you'll consider supporting the little 2-year endeavor I've been working on with the publisher. Publisher's Canadian, out in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. It was printed in Canada. Great little tabletop photo book, lots of Alberta history. So please take a moment, check it out, support it. It'd be great. I really appreciate it. And now we'll go to our first presenter, Brent Cox, a contaminated site specialist with Nova Scotia Environment. So this is something different. We don't usually venture outside of Alberta or a federal presentation, so I thought we'd include something different so we get to see a different perspective from another side of the country. So Brent, I think I've given you control. There we go. And I will be back as usual with questions. So Brent, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Joe. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brent Cox. I currently serve as Regulator Co-Chair for Atlantic Peary, and I'm a Contaminated Site Specialist with Nova Scotia Department of Environment. Today I'm presenting on the incorporation of Atlantic Rebecca within Nova Scotia's Contaminated Site Regulations. There are a few acronyms there, which I will explain in the first few slides, so don't feel lost quite yet. I'm going to start with who is Atlantic Peary, followed by what is Rebecca. I'll give a brief overview of Nova Scotia's guidelines for the management of contaminated sites, which in 2013 were replaced by the Contaminated Site Regulations. Both the guidelines and the regulations incorporated the Rebecca process. Finally, I'll touch upon possible future incorporation of Atlantic Peary products into Nova Scotia's Contaminated Sites Regulations. Atlantic Partnership in Risk-Based Corrective Action Implementation, or Atlantic Peary, is a partnership between regulators, industry, and consultants. Partnership was established in 1997 through a Memorandum of Understanding signed by the Deputy Ministers of the Atlantic Province's government departments responsible for environmental regulation. Peary is unique in that its members leave their day job hats at the door and work collaboratively to achieve the greater goals of Peary. Beyond core membership, other individuals or representatives may be invited to participate as general contributors or as members of a specific task or project group. Rebecca, or Risk-Based Corrective Action, is a risk assessment and risk management toolkit for dealing with petroleum hydrocarbon impacts. The toolkit is based on scientific standards, principles, and processes developed by United States environmental professionals and ASTM International. In general, in generating Atlantic Rebecca software, Atlantic Peary tailored the model to suit typical site conditions in Atlantic Canada. In addition to the Excel-based model, Rebecca also includes supporting technical guidance on the use of the model, guidelines for conducting site assessments, and an ecological screening framework. The Rebecca process utilizes a two-tiered approach, including Tier 1 generic or conservative remediation levels based on default conditions, and established pathway-specific or site-specific remediation levels based on site-specific conditions. Nova Scotia endorsed the Rebecca process for use within the guidelines for the management of contaminated sites through the Memorandum of Understanding mentioned previously. Whereas the Rebecca toolkit is specific to petroleum hydrocarbons, environmental standards for other contaminants of concern were typically adopted from other jurisdictions, such as CCME, other provinces, US EPA, as warranted. Adopted into law in 2013, the contaminated site regulations include a published set of Tier 1 environmental quality standards and Tier 2 pathway-specific standards for over 140 substances. These standards were adopted based on an established hierarchy consisting of Atlantic Rebecca for petroleum hydrocarbons, then CCME, other provincial standards, US EPA, individual states, and other countries. The regulations also include supporting technical requirements similar to the Rebecca process. The regulations outline requirements expected of the person deemed responsible for contamination and their site professional. The regulations dictate that a qualified site professional is required to supervise environmental work conducted under the regulations and declare that adherence to the regulations has been met. The regulations specify timeframes for completion of assessment and remediation. Allowable remediation level approaches include Tier 1 environmental quality standards, Tier 2 pathway-specific standards, Tier 2 site-specific risk assessments, and exposure management measures. The regulations require evaluation of contamination for notification or exemption. Once notification is made, there is a requirement to adhere to the ministerial protocols which provide guidance on mandatory aspects of the program. While not the focus of this presentation, details specific to contaminated site regulation components are available on the Nova Scotia Contaminated Sites website. The 7 ministerial protocols generally mirror the chronologic advancement of a site through the regulations. Portions of the Rebecca process have been incorporated within most of these protocols, specifically the remediation levels and remedial action plan protocols. The remediation levels and remedial action plan protocols provide the basis for determining remediation levels and documenting the plan to achieve site-specific remediation objectives based on the Rebecca process. A few scenarios include using direct measurement of soil vapor or indoor air concentrations, whereby taking precedence over Tier 2 modeled indoor air values, and identification of which default parameters can be modified and what effects the modification might have on closure conditions. For example, changing the exposure frequency or duration via building restrictions results in conditional closure. Unconditional closure meets the applicable criteria and has no ongoing management conditions. Conditional closure occurs when applicable criteria are not met, but risks are managed by other means, whereby requiring long-term exposure management. Long-term exposure management involves managing contamination left on the site by controlling exposure through engineering, physical, or administrative controls. This results in conditional closure with long-term site management conditions recorded in the record of site condition, which is a required closure documentation in the regulations. Going forward, Atlantic Peary is planning to release an updated version 4 toolkit, which in addition to petroleum hydrocarbons will include select chlorinated solvents. Atlantic Peary also plans to publish harmonized Tier 1 environmental quality standards and pathway-specific standards for protection of both human health and ecological receptors. Once released by Peary, it is anticipated that Nova Scotia will incorporate these products into the contaminated site regulations. Thanks for listening. I'll entertain any questions people have, and I've got some information provided on contacting either Nova Scotia Government Contaminated Sites Group or the Atlantic Peary Group.
Thanks, Brent. Anybody have any questions for Brent? A lot of information, quick presentation. If anybody has some specific questions, feel free to type them in the chat. Brent, doesn't look like we'll have any questions at this time, but if anyone has any questions afterwards, you can reach out to them at those email addresses on the screen or contact me and I can pass on Brent's contact info. So thank you again, Brent.
Most certainly, yeah.
Yeah, appreciate that.
Thanks.
Okay, we'll move on to our next presenter, Chelsea Pedro with the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, to tell us all about their organization and what they're up to. So give me a second and I'll switch everything over. Chelsea, you should have control. Perfect.
All right.
And we can hear you.
Guys... Oh, perfect. Okay.
And the slides are working. Yep.
Awesome. Okay. Well, as Joe mentioned, my name is Chelsea Pedro. I'm a project manager with the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, and I'll be talking to you today about the Impact Assessment Act. My colleague Susan Teague should also be on the line, and she might jump in if I miss anything, but given this presentation a few times, I think I've got everything covered, but just in case, she's on the line as well. All right. So I'll just give you a brief outline of what the presentation is going to look like. First of all, I'll give you a bit of an overview of the Impact Assessment Act, including some principles of the Act, some key changes from ESAA 2012, which was the previous federal environmental assessment legislation that was in place. An overview of projects subject to the Act and some of the regulations under the Impact Assessment Act and types of assessments and opportunities for cooperation, and then just the process in general and any supporting implementation documents that we have. And I'll leave some time at the end for any questions if you have them, so just keep a note and I'll be happy to answer your questions. So on August 28th, 2019, so just over a year ago, the Impact Assessment Act came into force, along with some supporting regulations, so the physical activities regulations and the information and management of time limits regulations. So I'll provide a bit more information on those later, but just for note right now. So when the Impact Assessment Act came into force, it officially repealed the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act 2012, which I'll refer to as ESAA 2012 from now on, so I don't bore you all with that long name. So when the Impact Assessment Act came into force, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, which is who I work for, was established under the Act and is responsible for conducting assessments under the Act. So the agency did exist before under ESAA 2012, but we were just called the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency instead of the Impact Assessment Agency. So some key changes. the principle of one agency to conduct all federal impact assessments. So under CA 2012, there were actually 3 regulators. So the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, the National Energy Board, and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. So the NEB and the CNSC conducted their own separate assessments for things like pipeline projects and nuclear projects. So under the new Impact Assessment Act, the CNSC and CER, they still exist, but instead of doing their own assessments for nuclear and pipeline projects, they do integrated assessments with the agency. So the agency is involved in all federal impact assessments versus just the subset that we were reviewing before. And then the agency, similar to before, reports to Parliament through the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, so we're accountable to the federal government that way. Okay, so there's some key principles of the Impact Assessment Act. The agency is committed to fostering sustainability through the impact assessment process, integrating scientific information and Indigenous knowledge in impact assessments, meaningful public engagement and more opportunities for public involvement and more outreach, reconciliation and partnership with Indigenous peoples, and the principle of one project, one assessment. So that involves a lot of enhanced cooperation with other jurisdictions with impact assessment or environmental assessment requirements to sort of integrate our processes and reduce duplication. And then predictability, transparency, and timeliness. So some examples of that under the new Impact Assessment Act is that the IAA has more defined timelines versus CA 2012. So there's more timelines defined for more steps in the process. We've also developed a more accessible and user-friendly registry where records associated with impact assessments are posted, in addition to records associated with environmental assessments under the old Act. We also post a lot more things than before. So for instance, any comments received during comment periods during the process are posted to the registry, whereas before they weren't necessarily posted immediately. And then also decisions made by the agency and the minister are accompanied by reasons when announced on the registry versus just the decision being announced. So we have a bit more transparency in why we made certain decisions. Okay, so I'm just going to go over some key changes from CA 2012 versus the new Impact Assessment Act. So as I mentioned, there's one agency to manage impact assessments versus 3 separate entities. We also have a more intensive planning phase, and that's supported by pre-planning as well. So during that phase, we have increased opportunities for participation by the public and Indigenous groups and other federal departments, which allows the public more opportunity to influence with project design and express concerns early, so that they can be addressed earlier on in the process, and there's more time to change project design that needs to be to address some of those concerns early. And there's more time to prepare the tailored impact statement guidelines and the plans and the scope of the impact assessment, which I'll go over in a bit more detail later on as well. There's also an increased scope of the assessment. So there's a need for more broad technical input related to health, social, and economic effects, whereas under CA 2012, it was focused more on environmental effects, whereas now we have these additional 3 components as well as other minor components as well that have been added to the scope of the assessment. There's also enhanced consideration of rights, particularly Indigenous rights, and coordination of Crown consultation activities. And as I mentioned before, increased efforts to involve the public in the process as well. So there's a lot more public outreach that's done, and there's more of a variety of activities. So in addition to the standard comment periods that we have on key documents during the process, we're also doing more to reach out to the public. So advertising in a lot more platforms. When we have comment periods, we're also holding like information sessions or open houses, that kind of thing, as an example throughout the process as well. And there's a focus on working collaboratively with proponents when preparing any documents. So any of the documents during the planning phase or the impact statement, which is the larger document that's prepared, the major outcome of the impact assessment process. So the agency is here to provide a lot more support and advice to proponents in preparing that impact statement. And the decision now under the Impact Assessment Act is made in the public interest versus under CA 2012, which focused more on decisions based on the potential significance of adverse effects. Now we've shifted over to a focus on public interest decisions. So as I mentioned, the physical activities regulations came into force with the Impact Assessment Act, and that is sometimes called the project list because it defines the types of projects that are subject to the requirements of the Impact Assessment Act. So if you'll see on the right there, I don't know if you can see that behind this. Does that block your view? Okay, I think you should be able to see it either way. So major types of projects that are on the project list are things like oil and gas projects, linear projects, and marine projects like offshore oil and gas, for instance, mining, nuclear, hazardous waste, that sort of thing. So in addition to those projects that are defined on the physical activities regulations, the minister can also designate any projects. So that comes in typically through a request to the minister or to the agency to designate a project to be required to undergo the requirements of the Impact Assessment Act and go through that whole impact assessment process. So that can be projects that are on the regulations. It's really any kind of project that we get a request for, we'll do the analysis and consider designating it. It can also be novel types of projects that we didn't consider including on the regulations, so like spaceports or something that aren't typical in Canada. That can also be something that's designated. And then for non-designated projects that occur on federal lands or outside of Canada, those are typically assessed by other federal authorities before decisions are made, not necessarily the agency. Okay, there we go. So the physical activities regulations, as I mentioned, is the project list. It focuses on projects that have the most potential for adverse environmental effects in areas of federal jurisdiction. So they're typically larger, more complex projects like large mines and such. So if you take a look at the regulations here, they'll list types of projects, and then they also have specific thresholds, so production capacities or a certain size of projects. So as you can see, there's more of a focus on more large-scale projects that could have effects to federal jurisdiction. And then there's also the information and management of time limits regulations, as I mentioned before. So that outlines the information that the proponent has to provide during the planning phase in particular. So the initial project description and detailed project description. And I'll get into a bit more detail about what those are later. It also outlines the documents that the agency has to prepare. Specifically the tailored impact statement guidelines and the 4 plans. And it also has a bit more details around when the agency can suspend the timelines for the planning phase and for the impact assessment as a whole. So there are 2 types of impact assessments under the Impact Assessment Act. So the first type on the left here is an IAA by the agency. So that's conducted by the regional office. So in my case, it'd be the Prairie and Northern region. So we would lead the assessment and the engagement processes for the assessment, and we would do the collaboration work to work with other jurisdictions and federal expert departments to do the assessment. And we also have some tools for cooperation, so like cooperation in itself, delegation, substitution, or joint review. So we would assist if there's joint review panels. And then there's another type of assessment, and that's an IA by review panel. So in that case, it wouldn't be the regional office, it would be a review panel that actually leads the assessment and the engagement during the impact assessment. And that's usually led out of our headquarters in Ottawa. We have a panels department that takes care of panel reviews. So in a lot of respects, it's a similar process, except that the panel holds public hearings to allow the public and the proponent, Indigenous groups, federal authorities, or anyone else really who wants to be involved, to allow them an opportunity to provide their views and to ask any questions about the information on record. And they have a bit of longer timelines than a standard IA by the agency, just because there's the hearing is involved and there's a lot more complication in that type of a process. So there's 3 types of review panels. There's a federal only, where it's just the agency involved in the panel. Then there's a joint review panel where it's the agency and another jurisdiction. So typically that's a provincial body, but it can be another jurisdiction that has environmental or impact assessment requirements for a project. And then there's also an integrated assessment. So those are the ones that are conducted jointly with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission or the Canadian Energy Regulator. So like nuclear projects or larger pipeline projects, for instance. Okay, so there are 5 main phases of the impact assessment process. So the first is the planning phase. The second is the impact statement phase, then the impact assessment phase, decision-making phase, and post-decision. So the planning phase in total is 180 days. That's the maximum amount of days that we can take to complete the planning phase. And it's sort of split up into 2 sub-phases, I suppose. So the first phase takes about the first 80 days of the 180-day planning phase total. And that's focused on getting information about the project and soliciting public feedback and deciding whether an impact assessment is required. So the proponent produces what's called an initial project description, which provides information about the project, what it is, where it is, potential effects of the project, and then we would post that document, and that's used to facilitate early engagement with Indigenous peoples and the public to identify issues and concerns that they may have with the project, specifically around potential effects or potential impacts to rights, that sort of thing. And that happens very early on in that planning phase, so from day 1 to whenever the comment period ends on that. So after that comment period on the initial project description, the agency prepares what's called a summary of issues, and that's a high-level summary of what the agency heard during that comment period. And then that summary of issues is provided to the proponent to inform them of what we heard and what the major issues and concerns are that we heard during that engagement process. So based on that, the proponent would then produce what's called a detailed project description. So it's similar to the initial project description, except it just provides more information than the initial. And then they would also use that document to respond to the issues and concerns that were identified in the summary of issues. And again, like, the proponents can address those concerns in different ways. It may be some sort of mitigation measure that they're planning on implementing, or they could change the project substantially, like the project design, to address some concerns, whatever they propose to do for that. And it also just, soliciting this advice early on in the process also helps to avoid any key issues coming up later on. And so it just helps plan the project and streamline the process later on, so we don't run into major issues that cause a major delay later on. And then, as I mentioned, at the end of this 80 days, the agency determines whether an impact assessment is required for the project. So if one isn't required, the process sort of ends at that point. But if an impact assessment is required, it continues on through the rest of the phases of the impact assessment. So then the remaining 100 days of the planning phase really focus on the development of the tailored impact statement guidelines and the 4 plans, which I'm going to go over here. So the cooperation plan outlines the agency's plan for collaboration or cooperation with other jurisdictions. So that's typically a provincial jurisdiction that may have environmental assessment requirements, but again, it can be other jurisdictions as well. We also prepare the public participation plan and the Indigenous engagement and partnership plan, which provides a bit more detail and clarity around how the agency will engage and consult with the public and Indigenous groups throughout the impact assessment process. They're very high-level documents, so more specific plans can be developed with, for instance, Indigenous groups to have a specific consultation plan, but those broader plans are meant to be applicable across the board, kind of thing. We also have a permitting plan, which provides information to proponents on the anticipated federal regulatory needs for the project to proceed. So, for example, if there's a Fisheries Act authorization required, we include that in the permitting plan to provide the proponent with a bit more clarity on other federal requirements for the project. And then the kind of shining star of the planning phase is the tailored impact statement guidelines. So that's the document that really narrows down the studies and information requirements for the impact statement that has to be developed by the proponent. So that document really provides the baseline information and the analysis that we need to determine the potential effects of the project. Yeah, so again, this phase includes further engagement and opportunities through a comment period and other engagement with the public and Indigenous groups and federal authorities to comment on the plans and the tailored impact statement guidelines in particular. And then at the end of this phase, the agency would finalize the tailored impact statement guidelines and plans and provide those to the proponent and also post them to our registry. In addition, we would also post the notice of commencement, which just signals that the impact assessment, the next stage of the impact assessment, is commencing. So after those documents are posted and we've posted the notice of commencement, we would then move on to the impact statement phase. So that phase can take up to 3 years from the issuance of the notice of commencement until we accept the impact statement as the agency. The proponent can request more time if they need, but that 3 years is the typical standard that we determined was typical for most assessments for the proponent to prepare their impact statement. So again, during this time, the proponent takes that tailored impact statement guidelines and prepares its impact statement. And the scoping of the tailored impact statement guidelines is based on what took place in the planning phase. Again, the proponent goes out, gathers information and studies. They do engagement with Indigenous groups and the public to inform that impact statement. And we also encourage the proponent to engage with the agency and with federal departments to seek clarity and guidance as necessary to help shape the development of the impact statement so that they're clear on any guidance documents that we have or any of the information requirements that have been defined, so that if there's any hiccups, we find those early on and we can streamline the process later on and have that be a bit more efficient. And then also during this time, the agency continues to engage with Indigenous groups as they're interested in speaking with us. Okay, so after the proponent submits their impact statement and it's accepted by the agency, we then move into phase 3, which is the impact assessment phase. So if it's an IA by the agency, it can take up to 300 days. And if it's an IA by the review panel, it can take up to 600 days. So the purpose of this impact assessment phase is for the agency or the review panel, whichever it is, to do a technical analysis of the proponent's impact statement. And it also includes an opportunity for public review and comment on the impact statement. And again, if the agency or review panel requires further clarity on the impact statement and the information provided, this would be the time when we would ask for further information or for clarity on the information that's provided. So those are typically called information requests. Also during this time, the agency or the review panel would work on preparing a draft impact assessment report and potential conditions. So that a report outlines the potential effects of the project and provides a large amount of information that will inform the decision at the end of the day by the minister. So there's plenty of examples of environmental assessment reports, at least online, to get a kind of a sense of what they would include, but typically it's basically the agency's assessment of the potential effects and our conclusions that the minister bases the decision on. And it's also based on consultation that happens with Indigenous groups and the public as well. So once the agency is done drafting that report, we have an opportunity for the public and Indigenous groups to provide comments on that report. We do engagement activities with the public to have more outreach and solicit comments on that and to make sure that people have as many opportunities as possible to provide input. And then we would also conduct consultation with Indigenous groups during that time as well. There's also the opportunity for Indigenous groups to co-develop parts of the report or potential conditions. That's an opportunity that's provided in this act as well. So then at the end of this phase, the impact assessment report gets finalized by the agencies, either by the region or by the review panel, and the potential conditions as well. And then those are sent to the minister to inform that public interest decision. So then we would move on to the decision-making phase. So for a decision by the minister, the decision-making phase time limit is set at 30 days. And for a decision by governor and council, it's set at 90 days. So I'll go into a bit more detail about the differences between those. So based on the information that's provided in that impact assessment report, the minister or governing council determines whether the adverse effects in areas of federal jurisdiction are in the public interest. The minister can make that decision themselves, or they can defer the decision to governor and council. And I believe panel decisions go directly to governor and council, if I'm not mistaken. So again, that public interest determination is based on the content of the impact assessment report and then consideration of these factors. So the project's potential contribution to sustainability, the extent to which adverse effects are significant, any mitigation measures proposed by the proponent, potential impacts to Indigenous groups and impacts on rights, and then the extent to which the project's effects hinder or contribute to Canada's environmental obligations and climate change commitments. So at the end of this phase, the minister will issue a decision statement. So if the project is allowed to proceed, the decision statement will also be accompanied by enforceable conditions that the proponent must abide by. So that decision statement is basically the way that the minister communicates the decision and the reasons why. And then the enforceable conditions are conditions essentially the proponent has to abide by. So if the proponent doesn't abide by those conditions, they can be fined or similar punished in a certain way. So some big differences between ESAA 2012 and the Impact Assessment Act in terms of decision statements is that under the Impact Assessment Act, decision statements actually have expiry dates, which are set by the minister. So that's the date by which the project must be substantially begun in terms of construction. So under ESAA 2012, there wasn't expiry dates put on those decision statements, so they could be issued and then the project could sit for 10 years and not be built. But now there's that expiry date so construction has to be substantially begun by that date. Decision statements under the Impact Assessment Act can also be amended. So for various reasons, if there's a change to the project or the project description or something like that, or a condition needs to be updated that's no longer applicable or something similar to that, the decision statement can be amended. There is engagement on the proposed amendments as well before they can be made. So it's not just made behind closed doors. It's quite transparent in that way. Okay, so after the decision statement is issued, we then move into the post-decision phase, which really lasts for the life of the project. So this involves any follow-up and monitoring that the proponent is required to do, and then compliance verification of the enforceable conditions. So again, the purpose of this phase is to verify the accuracy of predictions and the effectiveness of mitigation through that follow-up and monitoring program. Provide opportunities for Indigenous peoples and the public to participate in monitoring. So, for instance, for some projects, we've had Indigenous-led monitoring as a component of this part of the phase for past projects. It's also an opportunity to continuously improve the impact assessment process. So from any lessons learned from previous projects, we can keep improving the impact assessment process moving forward. And then again, promoting and ensuring compliance with the Impact Assessment Act itself and with the decision statement and the enforceable conditions. So the agency actually has a compliance and enforcement division that takes care of that as well. Okay, so the following guidance documents that are listed are available on the agency's website, and they provide a little more info for practitioners conducting impact assessments or just involved in them generally, or if you're just interested in the impact assessment process. So the practitioner's guide itself provides guidance on the tailored impact statement guidelines. So there's actually a template of the generic version of the tailored impact statement guidelines that sort of applies to a broader range of projects. So you'll see that there's sections that pertain to mines, for instance, and also marine projects, that kind of thing. So it's kind of a generic template that applies to a broad range. And then that would be tailored down for a specific project, but just as an example of what something like that would look like. There's also a guide to preparing the initial and the detailed project descriptions that the proponent has to prepare early on in the process. And then there's some templates for the plans that I mentioned that are issued at the end of the planning phase, and just guidance to support assessment of new factors. So, health, social, and economic factors, and gender-based analysis, assessments of impacts to rights, that kind of guidance. And just to note that the policy and guidance documents that are on our website are interim, and they can be updated to reflect comments and any lessons learned as we continue to implement the Act and go through more impact assessments for different types of projects. So as I mentioned, the agency has a website and an updated registry. So the agency's website contains updated impact assessment process and policy information, guidance documents, as I mentioned. And then we also advertise opportunities for training on the new Act. Before COVID, we were doing quite a few in-person training sessions. I'm not sure what the current plan is for virtual sessions, but that's something that will be posted on the website for any opportunities that are coming up. And then the Canadian Impact Assessment Registry, which provides information on current impact assessments for designated projects that are listed on the project list, any projects on federal lands that require a review, any regional assessments, and then any assessments continuing under SEA 2012. So there are a couple of projects that were already in the environmental assessment process when the new act came into force, and those projects continued under the old act as per the transition provisions under the Impact Assessment Act. And then the registry also now provides an online engagement platform, so it's a way that Canadians can provide comments to the agency directly to the registry instead of providing comments written or through email or something. You can comment directly to the registry now. And that's what we call the submit a comment feature on the registry. And then this slide just lists some more guidance documents that are available on the agency's website to assist with implementation of the requirements of the Impact Assessment Act. There's guidance on the agency or the Government of Canada's environmental obligations and climate change commitments. So just information on requirements and expectations for considering those obligations and commitments, and assessing the extent to which the effects of a project could hinder or contribute to the ability of Canada to meet those obligations. There's also guidance on assessing the need for, purpose of, alternatives to, and alternative means of a project. There's also guidance on the public interest determination, so just providing like background information on how that decision is made, the factors that are considered, the documents produced throughout the impact assessment and how those inform that decision, sort of thing. There's also guidance on Indigenous knowledge under the Impact Assessment Act, so procedures for working with Indigenous communities, best practices, how to engage with groups and consider Indigenous knowledge in the impact assessment, and then guidance on protecting confidential information such as Indigenous knowledge that can't necessarily be shared publicly or that Indigenous communities may not want to be shared publicly, and how to protect that. There's also interim guidance on collaboration with Indigenous peoples, so how to provide opportunities for collaboration, partnership, meaningful engagement, and possible mechanisms to work towards achieving consent and engaging with groups in a meaningful way. So this slide then just outlines the agency's forward regulatory plan and the 4 new regulations that are being developed by folks in the agency. So the first is cost recovery regulations. We're also working on a regulation to designate offshore exploratory drilling in like the Newfoundland and Labrador area. Indigenous cooperation regulations, the designated classes of project order. And you can find more information on this forward regulatory plan and the regulations themselves at the following link here. And I can share this presentation with Joe as well if you like that link. Okay, so I just wanted to touch a bit on some of the operational implications of COVID. So due to COVID, we have had to change up how we do some things at the agency, particularly our engagement with the public and Indigenous groups. Since typically we would travel to communities or to reserves to meet with the public or Indigenous groups, but with COVID, we can't really do that. So we are continuing to do consultation with Indigenous groups and engage with the public. It's just being done more virtually. So for instance, some comment periods have been extended to allow additional time for a review of documents and to provide feedback. And we are also advancing our virtual engagement opportunities. So expanding the platforms that we have to do virtual engagement and being more innovative in the approaches that we take to virtual engagements, particularly for remote communities that may not have, a good internet connection to participate in like a Skype meeting or something. So that sort of thing. Okay, so here just provide some links to our website and to the registry and the link to our training. And the agency also has a Twitter website as well where we post announcements related to the agency in general or to specific projects. So you can follow that as well if you're on Twitter. And that's the end of my presentation. So if there's any questions or anything, feel free to shout them out.
Thank you, Chelsea. A lot of information there. You guys are up to a lot of stuff. I'll give everyone, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat and I'll relay them to Chelsea. how are public interest determination factors weighted? Are each equally important?
That is a good question. I mean, it depends on the project. Some considerations aren't necessarily relevant to every project, but I wouldn't say that one is given more weight over another. They're fairly equally considered. Again, that's the minister's discretion. That's something that the agency informed, and we provide the minister with the information that they need to make that decision and to weigh those factors. But it's the minister's discretion at the end of the day.
Okay. Any other questions for? Will the terms of reference for socioeconomic analysis for projects be similar for large projects, or will they need to be tailored? What is the general objective?
So some things are more general. If you take a look at the guidelines, there's points in there that are applicable to all projects, but there are some things that'll have to be tailored specifically to a project. So when we're developing the tailored impact statement guidelines, we try to make it as specific to the project as possible. So if there's particular concerns that are brought up during the comment period on the initial project description or during the comment period on the tailored impact statement guidelines, we try to make sure that those concerns are incorporated into the tailored impact statement guidelines so that the proponent has an opportunity to provide information on those topics and provide information of how they plan to address those concerns.
Okay, which of the two types of impact assessments does Coalspur Vista Mine fall under?
I'm not too involved on that project, but I believe it was a designated project, and I'm not sure exactly if it's an IA by the agency or by review panel. Susan may have a better answer. Were you involved on that project, Susan?
Well, Susan's online, but she needs to turn her mic on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, Susan.
Fabulous. So yes, Chelsea Coalspur was designated by the minister. And at this point in time, we have yet to receive an initial project description by the proponent. The minister's designation of the project requires the proponent to provide us with initial project description, of which we then go for a public comment period. So casting ourselves back to the presentation that Chelsea gave and described the process, the planning process that occurs will occur for the Coalspur project also if the proponent chooses to continue.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for Chelsea? It doesn't look like it. So thank you again, Chelsea. Thank you, Susan. Thanks for helping us out and doing this presentation. Really appreciate you guys being involved. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Okay.
Do you take the screen back from me, or do I give it back to you somehow?
I will. Yeah, I will. Yeah.
Okay.
Right now. So we're a little early, so let's we have a break. We'll take a quick coffee break from until 2 o'clock, and then we'll power through on the rest of our remaining presentations. So we'll just see everyone back here quickly. Don't need to log out or anything. Just stay on, and we'll be right back. Jacqueline, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Can you let, I don't see John and Anad online. Can you let them know we're about 10 minutes early?
Yep, I'm just actually emailing them that.
Okay,
So I'll
thanks.
ask them
Saw
to
John
get
on
logged
for-
in.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks. Hey, John, are you on now?
I am,
Ah, okay. Joe's just stepped away for a minute, so
and I'm just sharing my webcam.
there
There we
you
go.
Okay.
Good. And now I need to be able to share my screen. Hey, Joe.
Yep. Hey, how are you doing?
Good. How's everything?
Good, I think. I'm going to just share. Just a second.
Excellent. Excellent. I have to remind me how to do this.
Oh, it's pretty easy.
Yeah.
Just hit yes when it pops up on the screen.
Okay. Show my screen. All right. So if I show my screen,
Oh, nice island picture. There you
nice
go.
island. Yeah.
let's see here. So if I do this, do you guys see the full presentation?
Yeah, it's perfect. Thank you.
And is it moving back and
Slow.
forth? Let's see.
Yeah, there's a little delay. Yep, we're good. Yep.
Excellent. Perfect.
So we'll get started right at 2.
Okay, that sounds good to me. Anand should be on as well.
Not yet, but shortly.
Yeah. So Joe, I can't actually see you guys now that I'm sharing my screen. Is that normal?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. Okay,
Yep.
good.
My camera's off anyways when I'm not there, so.
Okay, good. All right.
Okay.
For the other presentations, John, Joe had, I think everybody's webcams were off, so all we saw was their slides, not their mug shots.
Okay. Am I supposed to take my mugshot off?
If you want, it's up to you. You can do that, and then you can turn it back on for questions if you want. You can leave it on. You leave it on for the short intro, and then go from there.
I'll just leave it on. It's fine.
Okay. Hi, Nod. How are you?
We can't hear you, Anand.
There we go. That's better.
There you
Hey,
go.
Joe. How are you?
Good.
Joe, is there a speaker after me today? Yeah, somebody from McLennan Ross, right?
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
How are things up in Toronto, you guys?
Good.
Good, yeah,
Yeah.
all good on this end.
As good as things can be with all that's going on. It's hard to believe it's been about 6 months since we've been all working remotely, eh? So,
Yeah. Yeah, it's going to keep on going for a while.
oh yeah. Well,
Yeah.
cases have gone up again. I think in Ontario we're above
I just saw
300.
that at lunch there. Yeah, well, Alberta's trying to keep pace with you, so don't worry.
Yeah, I think the challenge is going to be the school situation, and that'll contribute, right? So,
Yeah. Well, and the limiting factor, I think, here in Alberta is hospitalizations and intensive care. So as long as that stays down, I think they're going with is you can handle you can balance that, right? As long as you're not overloading the system. So
right, right.
Congrats on your book, Joe, as well.
thanks.
Yeah, we see some cool updates on LinkedIn on that.
Yeah,
Awesome.
Thanks.
very
Yeah.
exciting.
Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it. Long road, but I'm enjoying it so far. I have too many computers going. Okay, we'll get started again. Okay, everybody, welcome back. Our next presenters are from Williams and Shire Environmental Lawyers in Toronto, great supporters of ESAA. John Georgakopoulos and Anand Srivastava going to talk about environmental prosecutions. How bad can it get, and is there a defense? So turn it over to them. When they're done, I'll come back for the usual Q&A session. So over to you, John.
Great. Thanks, Joe, and good afternoon, everyone. So our talk today is about the defense of environmental prosecutions. What we're going to discuss is a number of different items, including environmental liabilities and how prosecutions form one element of these liabilities. We'll then talk about potential legal defenses, then move into a discussion about some recent environmental prosecution cases, and then wrap up with some points about sentencing and the implications of being convicted, whether that's through a guilty plea or a decision of the court at trial. So as a starting point, there are two different types of environmental legal liability: regulatory liability and civil liability. Regulatory liability comes in two main forms. The first type of regulatory liability comes in the form of an order issued by the regulator. The order can require a party to take certain steps, for example, requiring the monitoring and delineation of contaminated groundwater, or the order can require that a party stop certain activities. So for example, ceasing that certain facility operations proceed. The second type of regulatory liability comes in the form of prosecutions, which is what we're going to be talking about today. and that normally results in charges being laid against parties that have contravened environmental laws. When we talk about civil liability, this refers to lawsuits between parties. For example, if one property is contaminating another property, the owner of the property that is being impacted by the contamination can sue the polluting party for the damages associated with that contamination. Plaintiffs in civil lawsuits normally seek damages for the cleanup or diminution in property value, but may also seek other relief, including injunctions to stop an ongoing environmental event. It's important to note that individuals and not just companies may be ordered and charged. In prosecutions, we often see both the company and individuals charged, whether it be managers, those directly involved, or the corporate directors and officers of the particular party involved. Less often, we see civil liability cases in which not just companies, but their corporate directors or officers are named in a lawsuit. An important case highlighting this is called Midwest. In Midwest, the Ontario Court of Appeal held not just the company, but also the sole director and officer liable and responsible for damages, including rarely seen punitive damages. So now that we've discussed the different types of environmental liability, Anand will discuss the potential legal defenses to a prosecution. Anand?
Thanks, John. So obviously the facts relating to any particular alleged offense are entirely specific, but there are a set of legal defenses available to any defendant in these quasi-criminal proceedings. And I'll walk through a bunch and toss it back to John for the last one. So the first defense worth considering is our Charter of Rights and Freedoms here in Canada. And there's a lot of complexity associated with that document and legal cases that have come from that document. But the part I want to draw your attention to is a distinction between inspections and investigations. And the basic underlying legal principle is that an accused has the right not to self-incriminate. And so we have to think about what a defendant has to do to comply with an inspector. An inspector is exercising his or her day-to-day abatement function, auditing facilities, seeking compliance, and how that changes when an investigator is involved. An investigator is involved once the regulator has reasonable and probable grounds to come to the knowledge that there's been an offense committed, or at least likely an offense committed. And it's important that once reasonable and probable grounds are present, that the abatement inspector cease collecting any evidence and turn the matter over to an investigator. And so if evidence is improperly collected, if evidence is not properly turned over to an inspector, we have this distinction in the Charter where an accused or a defendant can seek a remedy. And so the two remedies are excluding that piece of evidence that was improperly collected, or if the matter is so egregious, seeking a stay, which in legal terms is effectively a pause of the proceedings for an indefinite period of time. The next defense that's worth noting is the de minimis principle. And the Supreme Court of Canada tells us in a case brought by the Crown against Canadian Pacific that the law isn't intended to attach penal consequences for trivial or minimal impairments. And so what does that mean? What's trivial? What's minimal? Of course, it's going to be fact specific, but we have this balancing under this principle where you have to balance what the legislature intended in creating certain environmental penal provisions as compared to this de minimis principle. And so in some cases, you might seek to argue that the de minimis principle is itself a full defense, which it is in law, or some environmental causes of action, for example, under EPEA or Ontario's Environmental Protection Act, seek that the Crown demonstrate an adverse effect. And there's a reasonable argument to be made in some circumstances where there actually has been no adverse effect, and rather any impacts have been minimal, in fact, trivial. And so to share a bit of an anecdote, John, I remember a handful of years ago, you and I had a case where there was an industrial facility which had a stack. On a particular day, they had an upset condition, and some small particulate ended up being discharged from the stack and settling on a handful of cars at the property next door. And I remember, John, looking at the pictures in the Crown disclosure, and it looked like somebody had basically opened a salt shaker and dusted it on the cars. And so you and I in that case made that argument, and there are many other cases where that may apply. The next defense I'll cover briefly is the defense of officially induced error. And as the name implies, where a defendant has been induced by an official, and you'll see up on your screen 6 points that need to be covered in order for this defense to apply. But essentially, the defendant needs to seek advice from an official who's qualified to give that advice. The advice is reasonable. The advice ends up being wrong, and the defendant, in relying on that advice, ends up being offside of the applicable law. And again, just to tie it back to some personal experience, we typically see this defense engaged where an individual or a corporation is seeking a permit. It often occurs that perhaps they've received some indication from the regulator that yes, what you're proposing to do is okay, and turns out that's not actually right. And so that's often where this defense comes into play. The defense of necessity is quite interesting, where we have, again, a balancing of interests between protection of the environment, which I think at 10,000 feet we can all agree is a completely appropriate and virtuous objective, with circumstances of immediate danger or peril. And where a defendant has no reasonable alternative to committing an environmental offense, the defense of necessity kicks in. And specifically, if the defendant can show that it only inflicts harm to the environment proportionate to the harm the defendant sought to avoid in that imminent danger or peril, it's possible that the defense of necessity can be made out. So one example might include an ammonia containing operation, where if there's some malfunction, a defendant may be faced in a matter of seconds or minutes to vent ammonia into the natural environment contrary to an approval, or have a true catastrophe indoors. And it's possible that the defense of necessity could apply if the defendant acts reasonably in that circumstance and chooses to discharge the ammonia. I'll stop there and turn it back to John, who's going to take us through the defense of due diligence.
Thanks, Anand. So due diligence, this is the big defense. The Supreme Court of Canada's 1978 decision in Sault Ste. Marie established due diligence as a full defense to environmental prosecutions. The court established a two-part test for due diligence. The first part is the defendant took all reasonable care to avoid the offense, or second, the defendant had a reasonable belief in a mistaken set of facts. You only need to establish one of these branches of the test to succeed in a due diligence defense. Under the first branch, a party does not have to exercise what the courts call superhuman efforts, but instead must exercise reasonable care, meaning a high standard of awareness and decisive, prompt, and continuing action. Under the second branch, that's mistake of fact, One has to have reasonably believed in a mistaken set of facts, which, if true, would render the act or omission innocent. Environmental management systems are an integral part to establishing a due diligence defense under the first branch, which is reasonable care. Environmental management systems are the systems that a defendant can show the court were in place at the time of an environmental event, designed to prevent the event from happening. Not only do you need to have the system in place through standard operating procedures and audits, but you also need to ensure that regular training of all relevant employees about these procedures was in place before the event happened. Zelstoff is an example of a case where the defendant completed only half of what's required to establish due diligence. In Zelstoff, a BC prosecution case in this matter, the defendant had ISO procedures in place that the court held would have prevented the spill from occurring if followed. However, the defendant did not implement and follow its ISO procedures, and therefore they couldn't establish the defense of due diligence. The lesson here is that you cannot leave your procedures on the shelf collecting dust. You need to implement them through training and continuous improvement. Contrast Zelstoff with this case, Control Chem. This is a case in which our firm went to trial and succeeded in establishing the company's due diligence, resulting in dismissal of all 5 charges. In this case, the company's production coordinator discharged liquids from 4 totes into an outdoor storm sewer, thinking they were all water. And this was against the company's procedures and against the employees' training. Control Chem's mantra was nothing leaves the building. Not only did the company have a general and specific procedure in place to require that nothing leaves the building and that all liquids are to be processed indoors through the company's internal wastewater treatment system, but the company regularly trained its production staff on these procedures. The company even trained its production staff about preventing and responding to spills of this specific substance that the employee had discharged. And this training took place just a few weeks prior to the event happening. So through this due diligence defense, the company was able to separate itself from any vicarious liability it would otherwise have had for the act of its employee. Our next case is Marathasa. So about a year ago, the BC Provincial Court released its decision in Marathasa. This case is important because it's a rare example of a case where the defendant succeeds in establishing due diligence, not under just the first branch, but also the second branch, which is the mistake of fact branch. In this case, the defendant shipping company successfully established that it had a reasonable belief that the ship which fuel oil leaked from was, and I'll quote it, built to industry standards with no defects, that the belief was honestly and reasonably held, the defects in the high-level alarms and the value were not foreseeable, all of the alarms were tested on a weekly basis and no concerns arose. The alarm panel on the bridge was tested every 4 hours without any concerns, end quote. So in addition, the defendant was successful on the first branch of the due diligence test, that's the reasonable care piece. And they did so by proving that it had pollution prevention systems in place and trained its crew members on these systems. So let's move now to Northland Power, which is a 2019 case. In this case, the Ontario Court of Justice again elaborated on the defense of due diligence in environmental prosecutions. Here, the defendant company, Northland Power, was charged under the Lakes and Rivers Improvement Act after some sediment-laden water was released into adjacent streams from 3 solar farms owned by the company. Among other things, Northland unsuccessfully alleged that it was duly diligent and took all reasonable steps to prevent the discharges. Although there was evidence that the company had expended considerable time and money developing a proper and reasonable system of prevention of erosion and sediment control, they contributed to the numerous discharges by stripping the land of its vegetation. The stripping of the land was a decision made by the company to avoid various financial consequences, and the court found that the company should have known this could cause erosion and sediment issues. Also, there was evidence that there were earlier sediment releases that were not acted upon to prevent a continuation of the same problem. So for these reasons, the court was not satisfied on a balance of probabilities that Northland was duly diligent in preventing the discharges. So now what we'll do is hand it over to Anand to dive into our case law update. Anand?
Thanks, John. So we've now heard at a high level about environmental liability, 101. We've walked through the defenses available and a couple of examples of the due diligence defense in action. The next portion of our presentation really focuses on some recent cases where any defenses were actually not successful. And the theme here is to try to highlight for you the types of environmental offenses that are attracting liability. Of course, they're not limited to the 8 or 10 that we're going to cover in this portion of the presentation, and really to think about the magnitude of the fines and the creative sentencing that's really being employed by the various courts. So with that in mind, I'll start with the Syncrude case here in Alberta last year, which many might be familiar with. Syncrude, unfortunately, has a bit of a troubled history with environmental regulators. And in this case, Syncrude abandoned a tailings pond which contained bitumen. I would argue perhaps an improper abandonment. And unfortunately, there were a number of great blue herons that were found deceased in this pond, one live heron that was covered in the bitumen. And so Syncrude was charged both federally under the Migratory Birds Act as well as under EPA. And you'll see noted on the slide that Syncrude's fine was almost $3 million. But interestingly, almost $1 million of that fine was held in trust by AER to fund wildlife and biodiversity projects, and that's a theme we're going to keep coming back to. The last sub-bullet on the slide, you'll see that $1.75 million were directed to the federal EDF, which stands for Environmental Damages Fund, which has a similar purpose in that it collects those fines levied to under federal prosecutions, and those funds are instead of being added to the government's coffers, intended to be used for exactly a similar purpose, to fund environmental projects across the country. The next is the Abed Mountain Mine, and there was a company, subsidiary company there that was holding back wastewater. It operated a dike, and unfortunately that dike failed, and that contaminated water and sediment spilled into the creeks adjacent, and unfortunately then impacted the Athabasca River. And again, we saw this duality of proceeding. We had the federal regulator bring charges under the Federal Fisheries Act. We had the provincial regulator bring charges under EPA. And again, we have a fine of almost $4.5 million. A significant sum of that went to the Environmental Damages Fund, but over $1 million went to the University of Alberta to be held in trust to create specific research grants on this topic. So we're starting to see some of that circularity in trying to use this money to, in theory, avoid commissioning of future offenses. CN, Canadian National Railway, is another recent prosecution in Alberta. This was interesting in the way that it arose. Somebody noticed a sheen in the North Saskatchewan River, and Environment Canada and climate change officers basically traced back the sheen more than 8 kilometers through the storm drain system, and they eventually ended up at CN's fueling station. And what was discovered there was an oil water separator that was faulty. It didn't comply with the applicable law, and about 90 liters of diesel fuel had been released, or so is estimated, into the natural environment. And again, 90 liters is not a lot. If you think about fuel and you think about perhaps your car or truck's gas tank, but in this case, CN was fined $2.5 million federally. Again, we saw the duality of proceedings, both federal and provincial proceedings, and another $125,000 provincially. Irving Pulp and Paper is out in the Maritime Provinces in New Brunswick, and unfortunately improperly treated wastewater effluent and was discharging this improperly treated effluent into the St. John River for the better part of actually greater than 2 years. And here we have another federal prosecution under the Fisheries Act, another large fine, $3.5 million. And interestingly, another $1 million+ directed to an academic institution, in this case, the University of New Brunswick's Canadian Rivers Institute, to, again, better study, better understand, and promote projects that are sustainable and increase wildlife and biodiversity in the area. What's not listed in that fine amount, although was noted in the prosecution disposition report, was that the company also agreed to commission a new effluent treatment system at some significant cost to the company. Kirby Offshore Marine is a British Columbia case from last year, and this is a case where a tugboat ran to ground. It occurred just outside Bella Bella on the west coast, and unfortunately, as a result of running to ground, over 100,000 liters of diesel fuel, as well as over 2,000 liters of lubricants, were spilled into the Pacific Ocean. And again, you'll see a large fine, almost $3 million, broken out under a handful of pieces of legislation. The biggest number coming under the Fisheries Act, and again, there was explicit reference in this case that the fine was to be used towards the conservation of fish and fish habitat in the area. And we wouldn't be doing this here in Alberta if we didn't have a hockey case, and so we got to talk about the University of British Columbia and their university ice rink. And so the home of the Thunderbirds unfortunately had some cooling issues. The ammonia plant that cools the rink was not functioning, and in the repair conducted by CIMCO refrigeration, there was a discharge of ammonia-laden water into the storm sewer, which ended up in a creek. Interestingly, CIMCO pled guilty for a fine of $800,000. The university fought it, went to trial. They ultimately lost. They were fined $1.2 million, ordered to conduct monitoring. The university appealed, lost, and John and I were speaking with counsel for the university last week, and we're told that the university is actually seeking leave to appeal to British Columbia's Court of Appeal on this one. The last case I'll quickly cover is probably well familiar to most on this video conference, which is the infamous Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal, in which the vehicles were equipped with these defeat devices to reduce emissions. And while we've talked about large fines to date, this fine is absolutely the largest ever issued, completely unprecedented under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and we saw a fine of almost $200 million. John?
Thanks, Anand. So I'll briefly touch on the next two cases in the interest of time and try to wrap up. Drever is an interesting case where we had a fine of $1.25 million levied for a Fisheries Act offense. The interesting piece in this case was that the entire fine amount will be directed to the Environmental Damages Fund, and this kind of feeds into the discussion at the beginning that Anand set out in terms of the creative elements to sentencing that we're seeing in environmental prosecution cases. Lake Louise, this is a case, Alberta case, where the Queen's Bench recently upheld a $2.1 million fine on appeal against the defendant ski resort. This was a case where 58 trees were removed, some of which were listed as endangered species without a permit. The actions directly contravene both the Species at Risk Act and the Canada National Parks Act. In the appeal decision, the judge noted that while the penalties imposed by the sentencing judge were certainly more than what the judge called a slap on the wrist, this was not a case of an otherwise good environmental citizen making an isolated mistake. The judge stated, and I'll quote it, "A mid-sized corporation operating in a national park failed to train and inform employees, leading to the destruction of a number of endangered species whose extinction would have impact throughout the subalpine ecosystem." Collingwood Prime, we're going to move to Ontario for our next case, which is an interesting one because it did initially involve jail time. This is a case in which the court convicted the defendant company initially and its corporate director for failing to comply with the PCB regulations under SEPA and failing to comply with a federal environmental protection compliance order. The trial judge fined both the company and director a total of $420,000 and sentenced the director to a 45-day jail term to be served on weekends. The company and the director appealed the sentence to the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. The appeal judge vacated the director's jail sentence and ordered reduced fines of $170,000 for the director and $150,000 for the company. The reason for this was because the judge found that the previously imposed jail sentence and fine were inappropriate given the level of moral blameworthiness and the lack of actual harm caused by the director and his company. So what happens if you're convicted of an environmental offense? Convictions under federal and provincial environmental offenses may result in fines, court orders, and in rare cases, jail time for the most egregious fact situations. Once guilt has been admitted or proven, the sentencing phase of the prosecution begins. This can happen through a simple joint sentencing submission to the court by the defense and the Crown, or it could be an involved hearing in which the Crown and the defense argue what the appropriate sentence might be. The court will weigh a number of factors when determining the appropriate sentence. These factors come from the applicable statute, but also through the case law, and in particular, the Bata case from 1992. Some of these sentencing factors include analysis of the extent of the adverse effect, whether the offense was committed deliberately or recklessly, if there were any prior warnings, and steps taken after the offense to clean up or prevent future incidences. Additional considerations also include the size and wealth of the defendant company and any profits obtained because of the offense, if any. So convictions for environmental offenses can result in a number of negative consequences. Firstly, the defendant, if convicted, may have more scrutiny and increased number of inspections by the regulator. Secondly, increased fines, both statutory minimum fines, if applicable, and higher fines for similar future offenses may also result. Third, the conviction will be publicly available. So for example, in Ontario and Alberta, as well as the federal government, they all publish prosecution bulletins and send email blasts to subscribers. Similarly, Saskatchewan posts news releases about environmental prosecutions on its government website. As well, the media may and often does publish news articles about such convictions. Fourth and lastly, a conviction may also affect the defendant's business, contracts, and of course, customer relations. So with that, we're at full time. A little bit about our firm for those who don't know, and our contact information if anyone needs to get in touch. Joe?
Thanks, John and Anand. I really appreciate that. If you have questions, please type them into the question box and I'll get them over to them. So we have a couple already. How are the environmental fines quantified? Many environmental damages would be hard to quantify. For example, the Volkswagen emissions.
John, you want to take that one? I'm happy to.
Yeah, so I can speak. Generally speaking, a lot of the numbers that come out, especially when we're negotiating, for example, fine amounts come based on precedent, right? And similar types of cases that have gone before. You look at the fine amounts, the facts, the similarities, the dissimilarities. Also, you take into account the steps taken by the accused as well to improve the situation, to see if you can get that number down. But in the Volkswagen case, I can throw it over to Anand to speak about that. But generally speaking, we do look at historical prosecutions that have resulted in fines, and you try to line up the facts as best you can for similar types of offenses to argue for a particular fine range for a particular matter.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that, John, I totally agree, is the fine is not necessarily the cost of rectification. In fact, it's quite often not. The fine serves more of a specific and general deterrence function. And so, for example, the Volkswagen case, I'm sure the cost to rectify was far greater than $196 million, whether it's the cars themselves, the reputational risk, the harm to the environment, all of those items which are so hard to quantify, as you know, the question quite rightly states. So sometimes in that case, the government is looking for an unprecedented fine because it hasn't been that bad in the past.
Okay. Any other questions for John and Anand while we have them here? If not, we'll move on to our next presenter. So thank you, John and Anand. Really appreciate your continued support of ESAA. Love working with you guys.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to go to Jacqueline Stevens now with Wilms and Shires as well. And I'll just switch control here. And Jacqueline is going to give us an update on clarifying or muddying environmental insolvency, post-Redwater review and implications.
Great, thanks, Joe. I'm just going to get this set up. There we go.
Looks good. Sounds
Did
good.
I share okay? All right,
Yep,
perfect. So thanks, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity, and we enjoy working with Joe and the team at ESAA as well. It looks like I've done something. Sorry. Maybe you can see me, maybe you can't, but certainly I think my slides are up on the screen, so I'll begin. So my topic is about clarifying. Okay, thanks, Joe. Clarifying or muddying environmental insolvency, and many of you will know about the Redwater decision. So we're going to do a bit of a review of the post-Redwater review and implications. And to start, we'll have a quick review of Redwater and some background. And then there's 3 cases, one out of BC, one out of the Yukon, one out of Alberta, and then a current bankruptcy in the Trident bankruptcy that's in Alberta as well. And then I'll do an overview of some implications of the Redwater decision. Before we get started, I want to just give a bankruptcy 101, and this in itself could be a presentation that could take several hours for us to go through, but just to put a bit of context around it. So the AER, Alberta Energy Regulator, issues operating licenses, of course, for oil and gas wells, and they have discretion to approve or deny the transfer of licensed assets. And AER will not grant a license unless the licensee takes responsibility for its end-of-life environmental obligations. And these include things like plugging or capping wells, dismantling surface structures, and restoring the surface structures and the surface to the previous condition. These are usually called abandonment or reclamation or end-of-life obligations. Before approving a transfer, the AER can issue an order to a licensee to remediate and decommission its wells, and those are called abandonment orders. So in terms of bankruptcy, the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act sets out a scheme for the distribution of a debtor's assets upon the debtor's bankruptcy. And under this scheme, secured creditors get priority over unsecured creditors. And this means that debts that are owed to secured creditors get paid first, and debts that are owed to unsecured creditors may or may not get paid if there's anything left after the secured creditors are paid. An additional piece of the puzzle is the position of regulators with orders, where the environmental claim is provable in bankruptcy under the Abitibi-Bowater test. And a claim is provable in bankruptcy where it meets all 3 aspects of the test. 1, that the bankrupt owes a debt to the creditor. 2, that the bankrupt incurred a debt, liability before becoming a bankrupt, and that it's possible to attach a monetary value to the debt. If a regulatory order was found to meet the Abitibi test, it therefore could become a claim provable in bankruptcy, and it would be treated as an unsecured debt. Although there is a mechanism that a provable environmental claim may have a first priority against affected and contiguous real property pursuant to section 14.06 sub 7 of the BIA. Are you confused? Well, that's a common feeling in the bankruptcy realm. So let's break down Redwater. The question in Redwater was whether the end-of-life obligations fell within the bankruptcy scheme such that the AER's claim ranked equally or ahead of the debts of other secured creditors. Or did the AER's claim fall outside of the bankruptcy scheme entirely? So Redwater held a total of 127 licenses for oil and gas wells. It went bankrupt, and the majority of Redwater's assets on bankruptcy were non-producing, non-valuable wells. Grant Thornton was appointed the receiver and trustee of Redwater's estate, and Grant Thornton disclaimed Redwater's non-producing wells and took possession of 20 producing valuable wells. It's worth noting that non-producing oil and gas wells leave behind soil and groundwater contamination, risks of explosion, and continuous release of gases. Properly abandoning non-producing wells can be costly. So in this case, the Alberta regulator advised the receiver it was responsible for Redwater's end-of-life obligations, and it issued abandonment orders for the disclaimed wells. So at trial, there were two main legal issues. One was whether the BIA said that the trustee could simply walk away from sites it didn't take responsibility for. And the second was whether the provincial orders to remove structures from the land, that abatement or that abandonment orders, whether they were provable claims under the BIA. If they were, that would mean that the payment order set up in the BIA applied, and only money left at the end, if there was any, could be used to pay for abandoning the wells, and they were in the same pot as any unsecured creditors. The trial judge said the trustee was allowed to walk away from the disclaimed wells, and the abandonment costs were provable claims in bankruptcy. The majority of the Court of Appeal agreed. Then enter the Supreme Court of Canada. The regulator argued before the Supreme Court of Canada that it was not a secured creditor, but instead was a bona fide regulator seeking to enforce the orders for the greater public good. Grant Thornton and the secured creditors argued that the Alberta regulator was an unsecured creditor and the regulatory orders were claims provable in bankruptcy. In a 5-2 split decision in January of 2019, the Supreme Court of Canada released its decision, and it allowed the Alberta Energy Regulator and the Orphan Well Association's appeal. The majority of the Supreme Court of Canada held that Redwater's end-of-life obligations were not claims provable in bankruptcy. According to the majority, the Alberta regulator was acting as a regulator, enforcing its orders for the benefit of the Albertan public, and was not acting as a creditor. Further, Redwater's end-of-life obligations were a public owed duty, not provable in bankruptcy, and that the sufficiently certainness of that AER would fulfill the obligations and the timing of that were far from certain. The receiver, as a licensee, was obliged to comply with the orders, and the receiver could disclaim wells, having no personal liability attached to the receiver. However, the bankrupt estate must still comply with the regulatory order. As such, Redwater's obligations were not subject to the debtor-creditor priority scheme in the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act. The pre-existing environmental regulatory obligations trumped the BIA provable claim priority regime, not by being a super priority, I'll put those in quotes, but by being outside the bankruptcy regime entirely and ahead of it. The Supreme Court of Canada said, bankruptcy is not a license to ignore rules, and insolvency professionals are bound by and must comply with valid provincial laws during bankruptcy. The Supreme Court of Canada clearly articulated that going bankrupt does not absolve a company from its pre-existing environmental regulatory obligations. In this case, the trustee had sold or given up all of Redwater's assets. So the money from those sales was being held in trust during the lawsuit. And now that money will go towards the abandonment and reclamation of the wells before anything is paid to anyone else that Redwater owed money to. So a big question is, what, if anything, has happened since the Redwater decision? And have other courts dealt with or followed the direction from the Supreme Court of Canada? We're going to look at 3 cases in the environmental context and 1 ongoing bankruptcy that have considered Redwater. Quinsam Coal Corporation owned and operated the Quinsam coal mine on Vancouver Island. The mine ceased operations on June 12, 2019, and on July 3, 2019, Quinsam made an assignment into bankruptcy under the BIA. A couple of days later, the trustee abandoned the mine without fulfilling the closure, reclamation, and remediation obligations imposed under the BC's Mines Act. In response, the BC government stepped in to undertake the necessary work to mitigate damages to the environment and to people. The BC government held about $7 million in financial security for reclamation activities, but the measures to fulfill Quinsam's environmental obligations were expected to cost several million more than the security that was held. Of importance in this particular case is that Quinsam also had coal inventories that it had arranged to sell prior to the bankruptcy to address liabilities it owed to one of its creditors. And there was a sale agreement and an irrevocable direction to pay in favor of the creditor. So the BC Supreme Court was asked to determine who was entitled to the proceeds from the sale of Quinsam's coal inventories. The secured creditors argued that they were entitled to them, while the BC government argued that the proceeds must be used to satisfy Quinsam's environmental obligations. And what we see here is that the BC court held that, similar to the AER in Redwater, the BC government was not a creditor and the claim was not provable in bankruptcy. The BC government was acting in the public interest and for the public good in issuing orders and in generally seeking to enforce Quinsam's environmental obligations. Quinsam's environmental obligations, as I mentioned, were not provable in bankruptcy. However, the portion of Quinsam's proceeds at issue in this case did not form part of Quinsam's bankrupt estate. This was based specifically on the agreement of sale of the coal inventories and the irrevocable direction to pay the proceeds that had been entered into. The BC court, in thinking about Redwater and how it might apply, they spent 10 pages of their 40-page decision reviewing the Redwater decision. And at the end of that, the court stated, at most, Redwater requires that a trustee in bankruptcy or other insolvency professional use only the assets of the estate to satisfy unfulfilled regulatory obligations. As such, the portion of Quinsam's proceeds was not required to be used to satisfy Quinsam's environmental obligations. Further, the court noted that Quinsam trustees' abandonment of the mine did not permit Quinsam's trustee to simply walk away from the Quinsam mine. Following Redwater, Quinsam's trustees' personal liability with respect to the environmental obligations was limited. However, the abandonment did not affect the ongoing liability of Quinsam as the bankrupt. What is interesting is that the BC court refrained from answering the bigger $100,000 question. Did the Supreme Court of Canada intend to extend the polluter pays principle to effectively create a super priority, again in quotes, for the costs and environmental liabilities associated with the closure of oil wells, mines, and other resource extraction projects? The BC court gets out of answering this question because it has only been asked by the parties to decide about the proceeds from the sale of the coal inventories. Also, since the Supreme Court decision in Redwater, the Yukon court has considered a situation where a mine operation went bankrupt. And in this case, the Yukon Zinc Corporation that owns the Wolverine mine ceased operations. Since about 2015, the Yukon government has held about $10.5 million in security to clean up at the mine if it's not done. The conditions at the mine after it ceased operating deteriorated significantly, and the estimated cost to clean up the mine skyrocketed. In 2018, the Yukon government required Yukon Zinc to furnish an additional $25 million in security. Yukon Zinc refused to pay, and then Yukon Zinc went bankrupt. The Yukon government has been using the $10.5 million in security to pay for water treatment and care and maintenance of the Wolverine mine, as well as funding activities of Yukon Zinc's receiver. The Yukon government brought an application to the court asking for an order declaring, among other things, that the Yukon government has a provable claim in bankruptcy in the amount of $35.5 million for the costs of remedying the environmental damage, and that Yukon government's provable claim ranks in priority above any other claim. So the Supreme Court of Canada held that the Yukon government did not have a provable claim in bankruptcy for the additional $25 million yet. And that's the interesting part of this, is that the court said they characterized the additional $25 million as an obligation to post security as a condition of a license. And an obligation to post security is not an obligation, debt, or liability that's provable in bankruptcy, because it is a secondary obligation and not recoverable by legal process. However, the Yukon government will have a claim provable in bankruptcy for any cleanup costs incurred above the $10.5 million security as a first priority against the affected and contiguous real property, including mineral claims. The Yukon government's claim for costs incurred would be secured against that property. And that is part of the super priority that does exist for environmental claims under Section 14.06 sub 7 of the Bankruptcy Insolvency Act. What is interesting in this case is if Redwater essentially created a regime for environmental obligations outside of bankruptcy, why would the Yukon government argue that the obligations to furnish security for the mine was a provable claim? Couldn't the Yukon government have argued that the obligation to furnish security was not a claim provable in bankruptcy, but rather a pre-existing licensing obligation that should have received the Redwater treatment? The answer to this question may actually lie in the structure of Yukon's statutory scheme for mining. In the case, the Supreme Court of Yukon highlighted that the remedy under Yukon's statutory scheme for failing to furnish security is prosecution and a fine on conviction. The Yukon legislature did not provide that a court order could be made for payment of mine security similar to the enforcement of a judgment. And without the ability to enforce payment of that additional security, the Yukon government may have viewed asserting a claim in bankruptcy and taking advantage of the limited priority under Section 14.06 sub 7 as the best opportunity to achieve reimbursement for its costs. In the end, it knows from this case that if it does incur additional expenses, it's certainly going to be arguing that this decision of the Yukon court is applicable when it goes to seek additional funds to address the environmental obligations. In the next case, this is an Alberta interim case, if you like, where a receiver sought partial discharge of orders and the transfer of books and records pertaining to the renounced oil and gas assets to the Orphan Well Association. And 3 unsecured creditors sought to delay that from obtaining that order because they were worried that the receiver had not allocated any of the sale proceeds to fund end-of-life obligations for the renounced assets, and also that somehow the unsecured creditors may be saddled with that obligation. The court granted the order allowing the partial discharge, and while AER's orders may have super priority, an unsecured non-regulator creditor does not. They acknowledged in this case, Redwater, that the BIA sets out a priority scheme for paying provable claims in bankruptcy, but neither the receiver nor AER has any obligation to prioritize the interests of specific unsecured creditors over the secured creditors or anyone else. The court did note that Redwater does not pose any barrier over the receiver's ability to renounce assets in accordance with section 14.06 of the BIA and could be discharged from personal liability. I understand in this case the AER and the receiver have agreed to market the retained assets to attempt to reduce end-of-life obligations by transferring assets that would otherwise be renounced. And this has the potential of reducing the claims against the Orphan Well Association Fund and hopefully allowing for wells to be reclaimed and remediated. The final matter I want to touch on is actually a current bankruptcy that many of you will be familiar with. Trident Exploration Corp and a number of other corporations. They had 4,561 well licenses and non-operated interests. And AER ordered them to address end-of-life obligations. And those abandonment and reclamation obligations were estimated at somewhere around $329 million. Trident ceased operations on April 30th, 2019, and PwC was appointed the receiver on May 3rd, 2019. If anyone's interested, you can go on to the PricewaterhouseCoopers website and you can find all of the publicly available information about this bankruptcy. And in the first reports from the receiver, it indicated that the secured claims were estimated at $71 million and the unsecured claims at $18.9 million. In an effort to raise funds, the receiver marketed and negotiated asset purchase agreements for Trident assets, including 2,644 well licenses and non-operated interests. The PwC fourth report was submitted in June, middle of June, and they received court approval for the remaining 12 purchase agreements that were there at the time on June 30th, 2020. The PwC fourth report indicates that proceeds of equipment and property sales would be somewhere around $6.3 million. The proposal was that care and control of 1,444 wells and 473 non-operated interests would be transferred to AER along with the remaining funds. And the PwC fourth report indicates that those remaining funds of the 6.3 million and some change, the remaining funds were currently estimated at 1.3 million. The receiver also indicated that it was currently exploring whether federal site rehab program funds could be applied for in order to assist with the abatement and reclamation of about just over 1,000 wells that were 100% owned by Trident. I know we're going to be hearing after this about the site rehab program. In terms of Redwater, this is the statement that seems to suggest at least PwC is agreeing with or following the position of Redwater. In accordance with the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in Redwater, any remaining funds would be transferred to the AER prior to the receiver's discharge to partially offset the ARO associated with Trident's wells, facilities, and pipelines not sold to purchasers or abandoned and reclaimed through the SRP. As such, the receiver does not expect to make any distributions to Trident's secured or unsecured creditors. The deals were supposed to be closing. There weren't any details in the PwC report. It was all maintained as confidential information. We haven't yet seen that the receiver has been discharged, but it is understood, at least at this point, there was nothing else on the PwC website that indicated otherwise, but that this plan, this process has been put in place and has been accepted as the way forward for Trident. I want to take a few minutes just to highlight some implications of what these cases tell us, but also more generally in terms of how Redwater may impact lending, real estate, even the idea of getting into a business where there are natural resources or environmental matters that are going to require cleanup or reclamation at the end of the day. And what we are seeing is that there's reduced lending to industries where adverse environmental impacts are common. There's heightened lender scrutiny of the borrower's environmental liabilities and potential liabilities, especially the end-of-life obligations. There's increased attention to the value of any collateral that includes assets with financial assurance requirements or security requirements. There's certainly heightened monitoring of these environmental matters during the loan tenure. And there's also a consideration by these lenders of the risk of not recovering in a bankruptcy, which is certainly what Redwater resulted in, what perhaps PwC is resulting in, or at least is indicated that it's resulting in, where a creditor will receive nothing in a bankruptcy. We expect to see a bit of a chill in terms of the financing of these industries, even where a lender would become a secured creditor. We also are seeing regulators continuing to issue orders against current and former directors and officers for environmental obligations, not just the companies. Regulators likely are to be more rigorous, taking into account a wider variety of parameters in order to assess the corporate health in determining what upfront financial assurance or security is required to meet remediation, closure, and reclamation obligations. Regulators are going to assess and reassess corporate capacity throughout the life of the project. And most of the time that is done. But I think regulators are going to have a bit of a finer tuned eye on what's going on in terms of the financial capacity. Processes may also be in place because of this to create better communications between regulators and licensees to coordinate those security requirements. We may also see regulators taking steps to amend their legislation, as in the Yukon case and with the new Alberta liability process or program. They may be able to then better position themselves in order to ensure that they're going to have adequate funds to deal with after the after effects or the end of life obligations. What Redwater has done is it's added to the law on the priority of environmental regulatory orders in the case of insolvency. And it confirms that the BIA protects trustees and receivers from personal liability, but that they cannot easily renounce environmental obligations. It may be possible that the federal government will consider amending the BIA to ensure that environmental obligations come within the bankruptcy scheme, if that's what, in fact, the government intended. This seems unlikely, but who knows? Anything is possible. So in conclusion, I just want to highlight a few key aspects. The Supreme Court of Canada says bankruptcy is not a license to ignore the rules. It's very important to analyze the claims that exist at the intersection of insolvency law and environmental regulation. It's very complex legally, and it's highly fact dependent. Very important to obtain technical and legal advice early on to understand what environmental obligations may exist upon end of life or closure. And there's still a question of whether Redwater creates a super priority. I think it's still open for debate. Maybe it just hasn't been addressed by the provinces at this point. Certainly neither the BC court or the Yukon court wanted to deal with that question. We saw both of them avoid it, partly because they could. They weren't asked to answer the question, but we still have a ways to go in finding out how the courts are going to implement Redwater in many cases. But we did see PricewaterhouseCoopers in the Trident bankruptcy, acknowledging the SEC decision in making the determinations about the administration of Trident's estate in bankruptcy. As John indicated before, it's a bit of information about our firm and my contact information if anyone has any questions. Joe, over to you.
Thanks, Jacqueline, for that in-depth overview. Yeah, if there's any questions, please type them and send them over, and I will ask Jacqueline.
I'm trying to unshare my screen.
Here, I can do that.
Perfect, but I seem to have hidden myself, but that's okay. I'm still here. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
So, do you think Bill 12 liability management expansion of the definition of debt could result in legal challenges if applied routinely for large amounts of bankruptcy cases? Sorry, large amounts of in Alberta bankruptcy cases.
I have to be honest and say I haven't turned my mind to that question. It certainly could happen. I'm happy to do a little bit more investigation and get back to the person who has asked the question if they want to email me separately.
Okay. Cheryl, if you asked the question, if you don't have Jacqueline's email address, you can contact me and I'll forward it to you. If a company who purchased assets subsequently goes bankrupt, what is the likelihood of transferring liabilities to the original owner? What is it? What is it? Is it a, sorry, what is it is a partnership scenario?
So if you've purchased assets and then the company that purchased goes bankrupt?
Yeah, subsequently goes bankrupt.
To seek back to the original owner?
Yeah.
Much of that will depend on what the agreement was based on and how it was structured. There may be an ability to seek recourse either through a civil lawsuit, or there may be provisions in the agreement about how that sort of liability could be addressed. Likely, if you purchase knowing about some environmental issue, there may not be any recourse. It really is a fact-dependent situation, but you may have an opportunity to seek that recourse depending.
Okay. There's a question to go back to one of your slides. I don't know if that's possible. We have to.
Which one?
Go back to a slide on what you predict regulators will do in response and elaborate on what you are anticipating or recommend you would like to see.
Oh, wow. Well, that all depends, I guess, on which client I might be acting for at the time. A secured creditor, I probably want to see changes where the regulator doesn't get the opportunity to have that priority over funds. As the regulator, of course, you want to enhance that. Certainly, there will likely need to be a review of how regulators assess and evaluate financial assurances. To ensure that there is enough in the coffers if in fact, for example, a red water happens and wells are disclaimed, that there is enough money already in the hands of the regulator to take care of some of those potential end-of-life obligations. There may be other situations like in the Yukon where for a regulator, they didn't perhaps have the legislative tools at their fingertips in order to make a claim differently. And there may be a need for regulators generally to consider what their legislation allows them to do. And as we saw there in the Yukon, the court did say, if you incur more damages than $10.5 million, Yukon government, you will have a claim provable in bankruptcy. And in that case, it says you'll have one that sits at least in some priority to other claims. So there may need to be just an overview to consider what types of mechanisms may be in place. Certainly making sure you have enough money through whatever process of financial assurance will be a key element for regulators to be considering.
And then one more. You might not be able to answer this one. Can you share your thoughts on discussions related to tech and selenium and fisheries impacts? Is there more that can and should be done?
I'd love to be able to answer that and have a conversation with whoever made the question. It's certainly not something in relation to Redwater that I've turned my mind to.
Okay.
And
Peter,
unless I missed it,
I'm
happy to chat with the person who asked the question offline.
Yeah, Peter, send me an email, and I'll pass on Jacqueline's contact information. So thanks again, Jacqueline, and everyone over at Wildlands and Shires for helping out with the webinar today. We really appreciate it. And we'll move on to our last presentation.
Great, thanks very much, Joe.
You're welcome. So Eric, you should see on your screen in a second a prompt to share your desktop. There you go. Eric, your mic's not on. We'll do that first.
How about that?
Perfect. Okay, everybody, our last presentation. Eric Applet with an associate with McLennan Ross LLP here in Edmonton. Show me the money, site rehabilitation program update. Might be a lot of questions after this, so we'll let you go, Eric, and then I'll come back for the questions.
Great. Sounds good, Joe. And can you see my screen up on your projector there?
Yep. Looks good and sounds good.
Excellent. So thanks for the introduction, Joe. My name is Eric Appelt. I'm an associate at a firm here in Edmonton called McLennan Ross. We do a fair amount of environmental work. And my presentation today is on the site rehabilitation program. And it's an update of what I'll be referring to as the SRP. So to provide a quick roadmap or agenda of how my presentation will look today, first I'll give an overview of the SRP, then I'll hammer down on some of the details. This includes negotiations, an application process, and an ability for landowners to nominate current sites. Then I'll look at some of the steps the provincial government has taken to enhance Indigenous community participation, after which I'll look to both our neighbors to the west and to the east in terms of similar programs they've implemented. And I'll finish up with taking a quick look at how the industry has responded to the first few stages of the SRB, along with some related initiatives that have been rolled out. So as we all know by now, the COVID-19 outbreak in mid-March of this year, it seems like a lot longer ago than that to me, but just mid-March, and it flipped our lives upside down. And I did the math on it this morning, and tomorrow marks 6 months from the very day that the provincial government declared a state of public health emergency here in Alberta. And we also know that Canada's energy sector, and in particular Alberta's energy sector, was not immune. And one of the steps that the federal government took in response was something that's called the COVID-19 Economic Response Plan, which many of us will have heard about. And what the response plan was a federal initiative to support Canadian businesses and Canadian individuals who are struggling to get through the COVID-19 outbreak. And I've quoted directly from the federal response plan there, and the quote assesses and addresses what's been, particularly Jason Kenney and other politicians in Alberta have referred to this as the double whammy. It's a surge in global crude oil supply, and at the same time, as a result of COVID-19, a broad economic slowdown. Now, what does this federal response have to do with the SRP? Well, one aspect of it was to provide funding to the Western provinces, so that's Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan, in order to support the cleanup of inactive oil and gas sites. As I've got noted on the slide there, there's about 91,000, rough numbers here, 91,000 inactive wells in Alberta, 36,000 in Saskatchewan, and 12,000 in BC. Those are all per the Government of Canada website. And when I say inactive oil and gas sites here, what I mean are oil and gas sites that aren't currently in production, and that those can be distinguished from an orphan site, which many will know are not currently in production, and the licensee cannot be located or is defunct. Now, where does the title "Show Me the Money" come from? It comes from the amount of funding from the federal government, which was significant. It totaled 1.72 billion, and the majority of that, as we'll see, has been allocated to Alberta. Now, here is a visual. It's a bit dated. These pictures are from October 2015, but I found that they were helpful in that they showed the quantity and the distribution of some of these inactive well sites. On the left side, that's the blue picture. That one shows the total inactive wells. So we can see that particularly in southern Alberta and getting closer towards Saskatchewan, that's kind of the hotspot in terms of inactive wells. And it's a rough guideline, but each one of those small hexagons, we can see that it's not uncommon for there to be over 900 inactive wells in each of those defined areas. On the right side, we have a picture of the percentage of wells that are inactive. And so we can see on that right picture, particularly in northern Alberta, there's a higher percentage of inactive wells. Again, over 80% inactivity, that's the red hexagons. Though that's relatively common once you get up into the Fort McMurray and further north regions of Alberta. So Alberta's SRP was announced on April 24th of this year, and it is projected to run until March of 2022. And the purpose of the SRB is to disperse the $1 billion in federal funding, and it will be dispersed in grant funding to contractors and, as we'll see later in the presentation, licensees in the oil and gas sector. The fund is administered by Alberta's Department of Energy, which, as we know, is currently headed by Sonia Savage. I've listed some of the objectives of the SRB as stated by the government of Alberta. Some of these are to create jobs in the oil and gas sector. The federal government estimates that there's going to be roughly 5,200 new positions created in Alberta as a result of the program, which would be excellent, particularly given the current economic realities. Second, to accelerate cleanup efforts and to quickly complete a high volume of what is environmentally significant work. And third, to decrease the environmental liabilities that are associated with and can be associated with oil and gas development here in Alberta. Now, how does it work? So the SRP provides funding in the form of grant payments for the abandonment and reclamation of upstream oil and gas infrastructure. Many will know that abandonment involves the sealing and capping of wells to prevent the leaking of gas or liquids into the surrounding environment. And reclamation is a subsequent step, which involves removing all the site facilities, remediating any soil that may be contaminated, and generally returning the site to its original or pre-development condition. Now, the funding, at least in the early stages of the SRP, is directed towards contractors in the oil and gas industry as opposed to licensees. And grants may or may not cover the entire cost of the site rehab work. In certain situations, the licensee themselves may be required to contribute some amount to the cost of the project. In terms of funding increment, so again, $1 billion total dollars provided by the federal government to the provincial government here in Alberta. And that $1 billion is to be distributed in 100 million increments. And there are different application periods, each with their own targeted priorities. So as you'll see, the first increment ran from May 1st to May 15th. I believe it was originally slated to run until May 31st, but it was shortened to May 15th. And that first increment was for site rehabilitation contracts for up to $30,000. So that's for the most simple and straightforward applications, in theory anyway. The second increment ran from May 21st to June 18th of this year. Unlike the first increment, there was no contract cost limit, and applications under the second increment were limited to what are known as Section 36 lands. And those are sites where the government of Alberta is paying compensation to landowners under Section 36 of the Surface Rights Act. The third increment, which we are currently in, runs from July 17th to March 31st of 2021. It's still in its relative infancy. There's only been about 800 applications received thus far. And for the first time in this third increment, licensees as well as contractors can apply for grant funding. And that grant funding is limited to $139,000 per licensee. The fourth increment, which runs concurrently with the third increment, also in its relative infancy, relates to licensees with area-based closure plans. And some will know that these ABC plans exempt licensees from certain inspection requirements and reporting requirements where their wells are suspended, they're low risk, and the licensee agrees to reclaim its wells in a certain geographical area. And I should note here that in future increments, where the details are still surfacing on those, but it appears as if previously declined applications will be reassessed and indeed have been reassessed. So there's generally a two-stage process under the SRP. The first stage involves contractors negotiating with licensees, and if successful, those negotiations will lead to an agreement to complete the cleanup work for that particular site. What's interesting is that the licensees maintain ultimate discretion as to whether or not an agreement will be entered. So at the end of the day, the licensee needs to be on board and really has say if the work will or will not be completed. In terms of cleanup costs, I make a note on the slide that these can vary significantly, anywhere from $100,000 to several $1 million per well. This depends on a number of factors, including the complexity and size of the facility, the amount of potential contamination, those kinds of things. If the first stage is passed successfully, so you have an agreement, the second stage is for the contractor to apply to the SRP. The agreement between the contractor and licensee forms part of the application to the SRP. The application also includes certain details such as the targeted work start date, the end date, as well as the specific amount of grant money applied for. The requested grant amount, it may or may not be for all of the total project costs. It depends on the situations, on the facts at hand. All SRP work must be completed and invoiced by the end of December 2022. And the Department of Energy has been clear that after a grant is awarded to a contractor, no additional grant funds will be provided for that specific project. And finally, I make a note at the bottom that the licensee ultimately remains responsible for the regulatory, the financial, and the other legal obligations related to the site. In terms of successful applications, if a contractor's application is accepted, the grant payments are dispersed in 3 different installments. The first installment is worth 10% of the total grant amount, and it's issued by the Department of Energy immediately upon approval of the SRP application. The second payment, which is known as the interim payment, it depends on whether the licensee has paid its municipal taxes for the project site. If it has, then that interim payment is for 70% of the total grant amount. If there are municipal tax arrears for the project site, this interim payment is limited to 50% of the total grant amount. The final payment is, again, that's the balance, so either 20 or 40% of the total grant amount is provided to the contractor upon it submitting what is known as a final invoice report to the SRP. Moving on to eligible and ineligible activities, not every activity or step taken by a contractor to actually clean up, abandon, and reclaim the site is going to be subject to provincial funding. And the Department of Energy distinguishes between eligible activities, which I have on this slide, and ineligible activities, which is on the next slide. So you'll see some of these activities that are subject to grant funding include abandonment activities, environmental site assessments, both phase 1 and phase 2, remediation steps, reclamation leading to certification, as well as other project-related expenditures. Some of the expenditures listed on the Government of Alberta website include the purchase of materials, renting equipment, employee wages, transporting equipment or workers to and from the site, lab analysis, that kind of thing. It's relatively broad umbrella in terms of legitimate project-related expenditures. On the flip side, activities which will not be subject to funding include any work done outside of Alberta, non-closure work on producing sites. So one example provided online is spills remediation, suspension and discontinuation costs, if not part of the abandonment or reclamation process, work on orphan wells. As we know, these are under the jurisdiction of the Orphan Well Association. Also work in progress before the SRP began, as well as other project-related expenditures, some of which that are listed on the Government of Alberta website are administration fees, the cost of preparing the contract bids, the cost of preparing the grant applications, that kind of thing. In terms of the contractors themselves, there's restrictions as well. They must be based in Alberta. So this means corporately registered and have operations in Alberta. And from a more practical standpoint, the contractors must meet all qualifications required by the actual licensee. So this can include qualifications related to experience, health and safety requirements, other legal requirements, that sort of thing. The Department of Energy, as I referred to right off the bat, has taken steps to try to facilitate Indigenous participation in the SRP. Again, I've quoted directly from the Government of Alberta website, and there's language speaking to the major role that Indigenous businesses, Indigenous contractors will play in Alberta's post-pandemic energy strategy. And the government has taken steps to enhance this role. Contractors have the option of declaring themselves an Indigenous company when completing grant applications. And there's several different routes to qualifying as an Indigenous contractor. But one route is to have at least 50% of the company being Indigenous owned and at least 50% of the employees being Indigenous. Once declared an Indigenous contractor, the company is listed on the Government of Alberta website for licensees and landowners to review. I should also mention some similar initiatives. First, the Government of Alberta has appointed a dedicated Indigenous liaison to the SRP. Their role is to, for example, answer questions that may arise from Indigenous companies during the application process. Second, representatives from the Indian Resource Council sit on what's called the Industry Advisory Committee. And this committee provides advice and feedback to the program, assesses what's working, what hasn't been working. I should note here that ESAA also has representatives on the Industry Advisory Committee. And third, there's been a roundtable established with Indigenous service companies, and that's been done to help facilitate some of the two-way communication between contractors and communities that the Government of Alberta has dedicated itself to. Shifting gears a bit now from contractors and licensees to landowners and other residents affected by these inactive oil and gas sites. Under the SRP, landowners, which include Indigenous communities, have the option of nominating inactive sites for cleanup under the SRP. It's a relatively simple process to nominate a site for cleanup. The nominator emails certain information, so a legal description of the site owner to the SRP, and the SRP or Department of Energy then posts a list of these nominated sites online for contractors to view and potentially do work on in the future. And as we know, contractors then, once they have a site in mind, can then negotiate with the licensee in question for an agreement to begin the site closure activities. The result appears to be that priority is given to these nominated sites, assuming they otherwise meet all criteria. But the Department of Energy is clear to state on their website that nominating a site does not guarantee that an SRP grant will be rewarded for that particular site. Turning now to British Columbia, which began a similar program on May 13th. British Columbia's program is called the Dormant Sites Reclamation Program. And as with Alberta, BC's program is channeling its portion of federal funding. In its case, 120 million, so quite a bit less than Alberta's 1 billion, towards cleanup of dormant sites. In BC, wells are considered dormant if they have failed to either reach the threshold level of activity for 5 consecutive years or produce at least 720 hours in the previous calendar year. If successful, BC's program provides $100,000 in grant funding to the contractor, or half of the total costs of the site cleanup, whichever is less. And I didn't make a note of it on the slide, but it's interesting to note that BC was actually the first to allow Indigenous communities to nominate sites, and Alberta saw that and thought it was a good idea, and soon after followed suit. Otherwise, BC's program is relatively similar. There's a nomination process. It's also been very popular. I'll discuss this when I get to the industry response slides. But in BC, on the very first day, there was over 1,100 applications, and those applications proposed over $150 million worth of site reclamation work. And so this is obviously great news, but this popularity has led to some of the similar pitfalls that we've seen in Alberta, which I'll discuss later. Next up, looking east, Saskatchewan also came up with its own program just a week after BC's, called the Accelerated Site Closure Program. And again, it's a similar program to Alberta's SRP. In Saskatchewan's case, they received $400 million in federal funding. And again, this is channeled towards abandonment and reclamation of inactive well sites. It's also available in $100 million funding increments. And as with Alberta, there's restrictions on the facility type, the contractors, the type of activities which are eligible, that kind of thing. Now, under Saskatchewan's program, licensees are able to actually nominate their own wells, and they're encouraged to nominate their own wells and facilities for rehabilitation. They're also able to identify preferred contractors. Some estimates from the government of Saskatchewan provide that the program will allow for the cleanup of about 8,000 wells and facilities, and that in turn will support roughly 2,100 full-time jobs in Saskatchewan. In terms of industry response to the SRP, I alluded to earlier that the first few increments of funding have been subject to huge demand, but while that's a positive, there's been for sure a mixed reaction. I'll start with the potential benefits. In theory, they are to contractors, obviously to obtain the funding. There's been just shy of $200 million in grant funding provided to date, which is a significant number, and that creates opportunities for projects, site reclamation, that would generally not otherwise be available. So that's a check in the right direction there. In terms of licensees, the benefit is that their previous oil and gas sites are reclaimed without the need to reimburse, or at least fully reimburse in some situations, the contractors who are ultimately responsible for doing that work. There's also the reduction of potential environmental liabilities associated with these inactive oil and gas sites. In terms of broader society, I've listed there, clearly there's some benefit to cleaning up these inactive well sites, which are often unsightly, as well as lowering the associated environmental risks that can arise from the inactive well sites. The program has not been without its criticism, though. First, and probably the major complaint, has been delays in the process. Again, that's partly due to the popularity and the responsive industry. There's been about 37,000 applications by last count. So just based on sheer numbers, the SRP has been struggling to stay afloat. The success rate has also been rather low. The actual number has varied in terms of how it's been reported, but it looks as if somewhere in the ballpark of 7,000 applications have been approved. So doing some quick math, that gives you about a 1 in 5 chance of success. And compounding that problem is that the applications that are rejected are not receiving a whole lot of feedback in terms of why exactly they were rejected. For those accepted, the majority of grant payments have been for downhole abandonment. So this means that oil field workers have been put back to work, but in terms of the environmental side of things, there hasn't been much in terms of grant payments and much in terms of productivity in that regard. But again, it's early in the program, so we'll see how these next few phases unfold. From a high level perspective, there's been a bit of a chilling effect on licensees. The licensees are unlikely to spend any of their own money cleaning up wells when they know that grant funding is available. And the same generally goes for contractors. If they've planned some site closure work, but they are waiting on the SRP application process to actually provide the grant funding, one can see how that pushes some of this important cleanup work further and further into the future. Finally, I noted at the very bottom of the slide that it's an expensive program. 1.72 billion from the federal government is a big commitment, and that's particularly true in this COVID era when times are relatively tight at every level of government. Now, in terms of related initiatives, the SRP has been working in conjunction with other aspects of the federal economic response plan that I alluded to at the start of the presentation. Very briefly, some of these other aspects are a $200 million repayable loan to the Orphan Well Association, and that's been provided in order to help the OWA in its work cleaning up orphan oil sites, orphan gas sites, that sort of thing. There's been a $750 million repayable loan through the Natural Resources Program of Canada, and that's been provided to support the energy sector, particularly firms hoping to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And third is the Business Credit Availability Program, which has been expanded to provide businesses in the energy sector with faster and more reliable access to financing. And as with the SRP, each of these initiatives are aimed and target both environmentally significant work as well as getting Canada's economy going again in this post-COVID era. In terms of wrap up, these are the 6 general topics that I've gone over. Unless there are any other questions, I know I'm the last presentation of the day, so I hope everybody's hanging in there. That's my presentation. Thanks, Joe, for the opportunity to present today, and I hope everybody found it informative.
Thanks, Eric. Great overview of the program. I don't know how many, if we're going to get questions, I don't know how many you'll be able to answer, but we'll try. So if once again, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them in. Also a reminder, we have a webinar tomorrow about some employment programs and funds available for hiring staff if you need it. So you can check that out at ESAA.org/webinars. Next week, we have our Emerging Contaminants Forum. Really appreciate it if you want to check out that agenda. It's on our website. It's going to be a great program, all-day forum with some great talks. And then we have REMTech in a month from now. 2 days, 60 presentations, couple keynotes. Great opportunity, and we really appreciate your support by registering for these online events. It's really helping ESA out. So we have a question here. I've heard of some SRP funding being approved to some sites that were already turned over to OWA as orphan wells. Was there any due diligence done to confirm sites applied are not orphaned?
You know, Joe, I didn't come across anything like that in my research, because the point of the SRP is to provide grant funding not to orphan wells but to inactive oil and gas sites. So no, I haven't seen anything in that regard.
Okay, I don't think I've heard of anything either, and I can check with our 2 members of our industry committee and report back to the person that's asked that question. There's a question, is McLennan Ross a member of any of the industry committees?
That is a good question. I would have to get back to the the question asker. I assume that we are part of a few committees just because of we try to maintain a presence in the environmental world. So if somebody provides the contact information, I can definitely get back to them on that.
Yeah, I was specific to SRP or I know they're not on. I know SRP is not on the industry advisory committee, but I don't know what other committees related to SRP you might be on. So I'll, if Ryan, you can email me, I'll pass on Eric's email address and we can go from there. Question, I'm wondering is there has been any discussion around the overall split of program funding? You mentioned there was criticism has surfaced. Has there been any thought about how much money is allocated to downhole versus site closure, REMREC?
Well, Joe, your conversation with me before this actually helped point me in this direction, so you might be able to provide a better answer.
Yeah,
but
I heard 65% of the funding's been for downhole work, if I'm not mistaken, right. And 35% for other work. Minutes from the industry advisory committees, we post summaries. The committee meets every 2 weeks. You can find them at ESAA.org/SRP. And we have a summary of the minutes from every meeting that's happened. There's about 10 updates there since we've been involved. So I think it's 65-35%, if I remember correctly.
That's what my notes showed as well. And maybe that'll change moving forward, but so far that's had the effect of propping up the oil field sector, but not so much the environmental sector.
Right. Can we get funding for a working well, but non-working portion of a lease?
My first reaction to that is no. I didn't look into that question specifically, but going back to the eligible and ineligible activities, any work done on producing sites is, from a starting point, not eligible for grant funding. Whether a portion of the lease may be eligible would probably depend on the facts at hand, but if your starting point is a producing site, it might be an uphill battle to apply for grant funding.
Okay. Have you heard anything about, is there any funding for, or SRP funding coming for NWT Yukon projects?
Haven't heard anything about funding in the north yet.
Okay. Okay, well, questions are flying in. I might miss a couple. Sorry. Do you know if a company has not been officially recognized as ABC program under program 4, is there an opportunity to still apply under the program if an ABC was created after the fact? Alberta-based company, I guess, sorry.
My understanding, and again, to provide a more detailed answer, I'd have to look into this, but my understanding is that stage 4, I'm just bringing it up here, is only for companies who had an ABC plan prior to the SRP, and it was suspended because of COVID. And then those companies are then available to apply to the SRP. I haven't seen any types of exemption along the lines of what the questioner mentioned.
Okay. With Saskatchewan funding, there's a comment that companies should be given priority due to the work if your company is located in Saskatchewan. Since we've now heard that it's mostly done on an honor system instead of specific review into companies providing the services, is there somewhere we can contact request a review into the program?
In terms of Saskatchewan's program, other than just going through their website and finding the contact person, I don't have much feedback on that particular question.
Okay. And you said, just we'll close with one more. Licensee initiated abandoning slowed because they're waiting for grant applications. Would base level abandonment slow regardless because of COVID measures?
Yeah, I think that those two factors are for sure working in conjunction. It's, you know, there's, in this COVID era that we're living in, things generally slowed down, and the benefits of this program have been delayed because of both COVID and because of some of the ironic effects of licensees, as the questioner states, as well as contractors holding off and waiting to see, you know, is a contractor going to apply for funding on my site? And after I apply, am I actually going to get funding for the site? So that, along with COVID, has really slowed down the program a lot more than the provincial government, I think, anticipated.
True. And I mean, I'd add that we're at 200 to 200 million allocated into a $1 billion program. Where there's lots of room to still grow and improve. And I mean, there's going to be a lot more questions than answers, I think, as we go along. But ESAA will continue to do our best to provide everyone with answers and get people to speak on webinars. And we'll try again here, maybe once they roll out the fall. Supposed to be an announcement later this fall about the next phase, which could be the biggest phase of the program. Phase 5, and we'll try to get someone on from energy at that point to discuss it, and we'll go from there. So once again, thanks, Eric. Appreciate that. Appreciate your help and your comments and answers. If anyone has any specific questions or feedback for me or ESAA, you can send them to me. Everyone should have my contact info. Once again, thanks to all the speakers for taking your time. Thank you, everyone, for registering and supporting ESAA. We really appreciate the support. It helps us out greatly. So have a great evening, and thank you again for your support. Watch for an email with a link to the videos of all the presentations. Thank you. Take care and stay safe.
Thanks, Joe.